Welcome to the Executive Compensation Podcast. I'm your host, Ryan Harvey, and on this episode, I'm joined by Sam Bricker and Tyler Papineau. Sam and Tyler both work out of our Lake Forest office. And Sam, Tyler, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having us, Ryan.
Yeah, thank you. It's a pleasure.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to this conversation. So, I know that both of you were very much involved in compiling really one of Meridian's most comprehensive annual studies. It's our study on corporate governance and incentive design practices. And this is a study that Meridian has consistently conducted for well over a decade and covers a lot of different interesting governance and design topics. So, interested to hear what you found in the data both this year and if there's any trends we're seeing as we look back over recent history. So maybe Sam, maybe we can start with you. I think it would be helpful for our listeners if you could just give us a general overview of what we're looking at in the study, kind of what are the topics it's covering, and its history, and then what are the companies also that we're looking at in the study.
Absolutely, Ryan. As you mentioned, Meridian's been conducting this study for over a decade, actually dating back to 2011. The study focuses on 200 large publicly traded U.S. companies, covers a range of topics that are generally disclosed in these companies' annual proxy statements. Specifically, we're looking at corporate governance practices, company policies, proxy disclosure choices, and incentive design structures. Given our annual cadence to this study, we're able to look at both short-term and longer-term trends across all of the topics I just mentioned, and we certainly look forward to sharing some of those with you today.
Yeah. No, I think it's an interesting combination to have governance, policies, and incentive design all in kind of one comprehensive review. So obviously can't hit on everything that's in the study, or we'd be here for multiple hours. But maybe just starting on a few of the areas that I think might be interesting. One of those being clawback practices. So the topic of clawbacks has been of interest for a number of years, but particularly last year was getting a lot of attention with the finalized SEC regulations that required companies to implement a clawback in the event of a financial restatement. Um, so all companies, at least all publicly traded companies, had to have a compliant financial restatement clawback. And of course, that generated a lot of conversation around should we go further? Should we have clawbacks that not just for financial restatement, but for other types of bad behaviors or other types of events? So interested now that we've got a year behind us and we're kind of able to see what companies have done. Sam, walk us through what we're seeing in the data around clawback practices that companies have put into place.
Glad to. So before the finalization of the Dodd-Frank mandatory clawback policy, this is the SEC regulation you referred to, almost all large public companies had some sort of clawback policy. Now, this new mandatory policy comes along and it sort of gave compensation committees a natural stopping point to reflect and ask, what other types of provisions or clawback policies should we maintain on top of this?
Mhm.
Based on the data from this year's study, while some companies chose to maintain just the mandatory policy, 78%, nearly 4 in 5, elected to adopt additional policies or provisions. I'll note that some of these additional policies were simply companies maintaining the existing clawback provisions they had prior to the implementation of the regulated SEC policy, and for others, they adopted new provisions last fall. Companies expanded on the mandatory Dodd-Frank policy in one of three ways. Number one, they applied a clawback policy or provision to a broader employee group. Number two, they added additional triggers beyond financial restatement. Or number three, they made sure that the clawback policy covered more elements of compensation, different types of pay. And maybe we walk through each of those individually, beginning with this broader group of covered employees.
Yeah, I think that'd be helpful. I guess one first initial reaction is a little bit of surprise. I mean, I think you said 77% of companies had some sort of broader protection. I probably would not have predicted that high if you were asking me 18 months ago. I think I would have said that at least for the first year or two, more companies would probably just stick to compliance and see where things go. So I guess I'm curious, and we can walk through this in some of those different categories you just talked about, as to like how far did they venture from compliance? Because you could, there's a lot of room there. You could just be maybe applying to a slightly larger group, but it's still just a clawback that is triggered by financial restatement, or you could have something that has a lot of flexibility, and companies could go after an executive for all types of various behavior that they don't like. So curious to what we found in the data as far as where people are falling in that spectrum.
Sure. It's a fair point on that prevalence statistic being that high. I think that 78% number is really driven by two things. Number one, most of these companies had something beforehand, and none of them were perfectly compliant with the new mandatory clawback rule. And so simply maintaining the status quo or keeping what you had before the finalization of these rules meant that now afterwards you have something in addition to what was required. And the second piece that contributed to this high prevalence, in my opinion, is the fact that there's a lot of different ways that you can expand on the policy. And maybe we start with the group of individuals that you could expand this to. The mandatory policy applies narrowly to current and former Section 16 officers. Some compensation committees said, we want the ability to apply certain clawback policies or provisions to a broader group of employees. Maybe this is the broader executive team that doesn't get that Section 16 classification, or perhaps even all incentive plan participants. So that was one way that companies expanded upon this policy. The second way, and perhaps the most common way that companies expanded on their clawbacks, was through the use of other triggering events. The mandatory policy focuses on financial restatements, as you mentioned, Ryan, but there had been a trend in recent years, in part driven by some high-profile media coverage of company scandals that harmed reputations without necessarily triggering a financial restatement. And so today we see companies adding other triggers like ethical misconduct, which was actually used by nearly 50% of companies in our study, or acts that led to reputational risk, used by nearly a quarter of companies in our study. And I think what we can take from this, Ryan, is that companies acknowledge that there are certain executive behaviors that create risks for the company that aren't necessarily related to their financial statements.
Yep. Yep. Any thoughts, or is there anything in the data that might be suggesting where we see this going? Do we think that clawbacks will continue to expand beyond the requirements, or anything that might point in that direction?
I think so. I do think we'll see from 2025 proxy statements and beyond that more companies will continue to adopt additional policies and provisions. Some compensation committees took fall of 2023 to say, let's comply, let the dust settle, and see where things go in the future. And now we've had 12 months into the future, and I think we can assume that companies will have adopted new policies, seen other companies adopting non-mandatory recoupment triggers, and look to do the same.
Yep. Yep. Will be interesting to see how it all plays out. It's a delicate balance. On one hand, every board would like to have a lot of flexibility to address the unforeseen and unfortunate situation where you have to do a clawback. And then on the other hand, executives need some level of confidence that when they earn an incentive, that it is their compensation, and that it's not going to be, in some way arbitrarily pulled back in the future. So interesting balance, and we'll continue to navigate that, really on a company by company basis. So maybe let's shift to another, I think, interesting topic that I know the survey covered, and Tyler, that's board refreshment. A lot of attention around recruiting talented board members, and making sure you get fresh perspectives and different backgrounds on the board. So what are we seeing from the data on the topic of board refreshment?
Yeah, great question, Ryan. And it's obviously something that's top of mind for a lot of people. First and foremost, I do think it's probably important to level set that we don't directly measure refreshment or turnover. We do a lot of things that, address that topic, but we don't necessarily have a question on there, where we're going through and analyzing that data point in particular.
Yep.
But Despite that, I think there really are like a handful of things that we're seeing that are pretty interesting factors in this question of board refreshment and trends. You know, First and foremost, we did observe a decrease in director tenures over the last 5 years, suggesting that there, probably is likely a good amount of board refreshment going on. Specifically, the number of directors with a tenure of greater than 10 years has decreased from 33% to 27%. It's obviously hard to say for certain the driving force behind this, or if it's a higher than typical decrease over that time horizon historically, but it's interesting nonetheless. Going hand in hand with this, number two, kind of, telling us the narrative that board refreshment is either occurring or is being encouraged. Director overboarding policies, are now incredibly common within our set of 200 companies, with more than 3/4 of companies disclosing the existence of one. This point's a bit more nuanced, but these policies have been lauded as an effective way to promote board refreshment. Per the Conference Board, a nonprofit think tank covering a wide variety of topics, director overboarding policies, can prompt a thoughtful discussion between companies and their board members. Specifically, this conversation is going to pertain to things like director responsibilities and commitments. And as these kind of, conversations come up and come up even more frequently with the existence of these policies, you can see a natural conclusion that in turn, directors maybe stepping down more frequently as a result.
Yep. Yep. No, I mean, I think we've clearly seen this anecdotally, and as you're mentioning, and now seeing it in the data of broader perspectives on boards, and just and I think with that comes greater engagement. I mean, I think that's something we've seen over the last 20 years is just more and more directors are very, very much engaged in the process, and taking their board responsibilities very seriously. Any other trends or anything that you're seeing in the data where you think this might be heading?
Yeah, I mean, definitely. So we just obviously talked about a couple points that say, hey, we're seeing changes in tenure that's pointing to board refreshment occurring. We're seeing the overboarding policy prompting maybe some of these discussions that's leading to board refreshment. Let's, kind of steel man the other side here really quick and look at what we're seeing in maybe the other direction here. Yeah, number one, only 12% of the Meridian 200 companies disclose a term limit for directors.
Mhm.
This has increased from 6% in 2019, but despite this, this is obviously very low on an absolute scale. I mean, only 12%. A bit surprising, obviously, because it feels like the most direct way to force or encourage board refreshment. So something to think about there. Number two, we've seen an increase in the typical mandatory retirement age for directors. I think this is a bit counterintuitive when you think about refreshment becoming more of a topic and kind of, more encouraged. Because obviously, as you as you increase in age, directors can serve longer. So refreshment might not be as, as occurring as frequently. Um, just a couple numbers here, just so we're tying it back to the survey of the companies in our study who disclose a mandatory retirement age. We're now seeing 77% of those have a mandatory retirement age at 75. This is up from only 47% a decade ago, when 72 years of age was the most prevalent retirement age for directors.
Yeah.
I do want to put a bow on it, so I think I'll give a quick synthesis on all of this, and we're entering the realm of speculation a little bit and getting away from some of the hard and fast numbers that we saw. But it kind of feels to me like maybe companies are moving away from things that force refreshment, term limits, retirement ages, or younger retirement ages, even, and the like, and are becoming fans of things that promote refreshment, like overboarding policies and annual director performance reviews, which have increased in prevalence as well.
Yeah. Yeah. Like almost everything we deal with, the key is balance because the fresh perspectives are definitely needed, but you also need experience. You need individuals on the board that have some history, understand the direction of the business over time. So there's again, like everything, balance I think is important. So no, thanks for those insights on refreshment. So I want to also talk about a little bit about what we're seeing from a disclosure perspective on pay and performance. Uh, this is, of course, a bedrock topic of executive compensation, the alignment of pay with performance, and being able to demonstrate that. For many years now, companies have tried to make a clear demonstration of how their pay programs align with company performance in their proxy disclosures, and have often taken up a fair amount of real estate in the CD&A around trying to demonstrate that either, verbally or through various graphics and tables. Of course, the last couple of years, we've had the addition of the pay versus performance tabular disclosure that was new requirement, and I think there's varying opinions on how much light that really sheds on pay and performance, but it is now a requirement. So curious, Sam, what are we seeing? I know that we looked at this in the study. We looked at how companies are disclosing that link, different ways that they're using to try to demonstrate the link of pay and performance. What are we seeing in that analysis?
Sure. Let's break those two different disclosures that you mentioned apart here. So we have on the one hand this SEC mandatory pay versus performance or PVP disclosure. And 2024 was generally the second year for most companies in this study, the second year that they were required to comply with that disclosure. And then there's this other type of disclosure you mentioned, a custom or tailored chart, graphic, narrative that takes up real estate and describes pay and performance in the company's own terms. They get to create custom definitions of pay. They being the company, gets to decide which executives are included in this analysis. It's sort of a tailored story of their pay and performance story. Interestingly, with the introduction of the SEC PVP disclosure requirement a couple of years ago, we have seen a stark change in the prevalence of these custom tailored graphics within the proxy statement. Specifically, the introduction of the PVP disclosure has in turn reduced the prevalence of these additional volitional disclosures.
Mhm.
So this past year, Ryan, only 13% of companies provided additional pay and performance disclosure beyond what was required.
And
Before,
you think that is just because it's confusing to have, multiple, even though I think a lot of us would argue that the PVP table is not terribly helpful. It also, I guess, could get confusing to have, even if you could create something more helpful, to have multiple versions of the same topic might be confusing.
I think that's spot on, Ryan. Despite there being some flexibility with being able to define pay how you would like and pick the time frame and pick the executives, I think at its core it's confusing. It could be redundant. Companies might find it unnecessary to have two separate sort of descriptions of pay and performance within the proxy statement. And they recognize that one of those is required, so they say, I'm just going to stick with the requirement. And I think that the data shows this, Ryan. We went from kind of pre-finalization of PVP rules, having about 1 in 4 companies show something additional, their own custom tailored story of pay and performance in the proxy, to now, like I said, 13%, essentially 1 in 8. So this has been cut in half over the last couple of years.
Yep. Yep. Any other insights on that front outside of those types of disclosures?
I think the one thing we'd add is that this is a proxy disclosure specific trend, not a trend at the compensation committee level. Like you mentioned, pay and performance continues to be the backbone of assessing executive compensation programs. And so while we see fewer companies including a tailored disclosure on pay and performance in the proxy statement, we are not seeing compensation committees give this topic any less airtime in the boardroom. It remains a key priority for compensation committees everywhere.
Yep. Yep. A good point. And just a few months back, I think we did a whole podcast with Jamie McGuff, kind of talking about all the different ways that committees can evaluate pay and performance. They may or may not make it into the proxy, but a lot of different ways to look at that. So I want to shift to kind of one final topic area. We spent a lot of time talking about the different governance elements that the study looked at, and there's many things we didn't even delve into. There is, of course, an entire other section of the study which is related to design and incentive designs. I just want to specifically dive into one aspect of that, which is total shareholder return. Been around for obviously years, been a very common measure for many, many years, continues to be very common. Just want to see, what are we seeing there, Tyler? Because I think if you think of the cycle TSR, it went from being kind of a archaic measure 20 years ago that was used by a few industries to something that is, heavily used across all companies. There felt like there was a little bit of a pause maybe 5, 6 years ago where a lot of companies were kind of pausing and reevaluating. Do we still want to use TSR? But where does it stand now? What are we seeing? Is it continues to be a commonly used measure, and how are we seeing it used?
Yeah. Yeah. Great questions, Ryan. I mean, so first and foremost, it is still obviously, I think, incredibly prevalent in the sample. But for the first time in the last decade, we did actually observe a decrease in the prevalence of relative TSR within the Meridian 200. It's worth noting that this decrease was very small, only around 1% or so. So it could be, due to just a couple companies entering or exiting the sample group. We switch a few of these each year. However, when you consider that over the last decade, relative TSR prevalence has gone up 30% in our studies, I think any sort of plateau, even if it isn't a genuine decrease per se, is certainly noteworthy. Um, Along a similar vein, of the 78% of companies that do use relative TSR, 39% are now using it as a modifier, which is up 18% from 2016 when we started collecting this information. Between the plateau in TSR prevalence and this increase in use as a modifier, you kind of have to stop and wonder if companies are maybe falling out of love a little bit with relative TSR as a metric. Might be understandable, of course, given I think we've all heard, how some executives feel like they maybe don't have enough control over a company's stock price, too many external market factors that are the driving force there. This feeling should be somewhat mitigated. We're talking about relative TSR here, of course, if you're measuring your performance against an appropriate performance group that's subject to similar macroeconomic factors. On that topic of performance peer groups, one other point that I'd like to make is we have really seen the compensation, right? It's the executive compensation peer group become less and less prevalent as a relative TSR performance group for measurement purposes. In 2016, for example, compensation peer groups made up 26% of TSR performance peer groups, whereas in 2024, that number was actually down to 11%, right? And I think this suggests that companies might be, recognizing the aforementioned issue with TSR and are not only addressing it by either, moving away from the metric or moving it into a modifier in their LTI plans, but they're also making structural changes within the plans that we think, ultimately may give TSR some added longevity within the marketplace.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that is, in my experience, the number one critical success factor in using TSR is comfort level around the peer group. And the companies that seem to where it seems to work well and they like TSR as a measure are those that have a peer group that they feel compares well to their business. And like you mentioned, we're seeing in the data here that that doesn't always mean it's your compensation benchmarking peer group, which is specifically looking at the talent market, but may not always be the best reflection of you know how you trade in the marketplace, macroeconomic influences on the business. There might be a slightly different group where that's better reflected. It sounds like we're seeing a little bit of a migration there in the data.
I think we certainly are. And I think indices, even broad based ones where we kind of get away from those similar macroeconomic factors continue to be prevalent as well. It kind of adopts the approach of measuring your returns against, the market as a whole or all other places an investor could have put their money within, I guess a similar asset class is probably a good way to phrase it. But yeah, I think as the compensation peer group declines, we're seeing a distribution into these other ways of measuring it relative.
Yep. Yeah. Well, this has been a great discussion. I know we've only touched on just a fraction of the elements that are in the study. I know the actual study itself is well over 50 pages, and is available for free on our website. So anybody who wants to delve into that a little bit more detail, feel free to go out and get a copy of that study. But thanks again, Sam, Tyler. Been a great conversation.
For the time.
Yeah, thanks for having us, Ryan. Appreciate it.